Welcome to the Steelers Breakdown Podcast. He's the PennLive Steelers beat reporter, Nick Farabaugh, and I'm John Luciew. And we shift gears now from kicking the talent down there at the NFL Combine out in Indy to looking at the Steelers' strategy for the upcoming free agency period that's about to get really crazy on Monday. But first, Nick, I got to ask you, you're back from Indy. What was the best non-football experience you had while you're out there?
I mean, the food out there is always good. I think Indianapolis is one of the more underrated food cities in America. You know, there's certain cities you always hear about it. But Indianapolis, man, they got some really, really good places. Pork tenderloin sandwiches, I think, are really underrated. That's Indiana's thing. It's a Midwest thing, but I do think it's Indiana's thing. I always get when I got down the first night. So much going down there. Also meeting just people, whether it's agents, scouts, fellow media members, fans, whatever it might be. Always a good time. So Indy is one of my favorite trips. I always love going to the Senior Bowl, but I really love going to the Combine just as much.
And leave it to the NFL to turn what was once just sort of an insular talent evaluation process for, the owners, the teams, the coaches, the agents, into this fan-friendly event that's, on TV all weekend long. And then from the sound of it, there were a lot of fans in the stands and they were cheering people's 40 times. And there were a lot of Ohio State fans in attendance from what I could hear. What was your view on the fan interest in this NFL Combine?
There was a lot. I think this year was the first year I ever heard people booing at the Combine. There were a lot of Michigan fans there too.
Oh.
Will Howard, the Ohio State quarterback, actually got booed every time he came up to throw. Isaiah Bond, who very fast Texas wide receiver, predicted he was going to break Xavier Worthy's 4.21 record, only ran a 4.4. He got booed. I've never seen that happen before at the Combine. But the fanfare is there all the time, man. There's fans all around the city. You see them just as much as you see the media members, just as much as you see all the people from the NFL. It's really interesting because, really everyone from the NFL and then the fans are all kind of smushed in this 6-wide block of the city of Indianapolis. It's really fascinating how you have everybody in one spot there for so long, for an entire week. And so it's really cool when the fan interest follows it. Obviously, I think the Combine has become a spectacle in and of itself. So, if you haven't gone out there or you've been able to get out there before, I really think it's a cool experience to be there at the NFL Combine.
Cool. That's going on the bucket list. That's for sure. And we'll get to those quarterbacks that were out there in Indy and that will be available in the draft because you're convinced that the Steelers are going to draft a quarterback, and certainly post-Combine and, in this, month, I guess 2 months before the draft, they're going to be moving up and down on the sort of list. There's already some movement that's kind of eye-popping, so we're going to get that at it in a minute. But I know the other thing you do when you're out at the Combine is try to get a lot of sourcing of some solid leads for what could be, this shopping list for free agency for the Steelers, because even though you're looking at all the talent available in the draft, that's not till the end of April. What's looming is this free agency process, and you're convinced there are certain positions where the Steelers are determined to go the free agency route to fill the roster out, and shore up some positions of need for 2025. So talk about the key positions that the Steelers are going to fill it in free agency, why they're taking the free agency route versus the draft, and who are some of the names to be on the radar when all of these breaking news reports are going to be coming in on, late Monday into Tuesday and throughout the rest of next week.
Yeah, I mean, the quarterback situation for the Steelers, we have talked about this. We talked about this last week, right? Where it stands, where they're going. First of all, I do think they're going to draft one. As you mentioned, I don't think it's going to be a first-round pick. We have seen some scenarios pop up recently in mock drafts where people have given the Steelers a quarterback. Today, Dane Brugler, The Athletic, who's one of the most reputable draft sources out there. I mean, this is not just a Joe Schmo saying this. Has Shedeur Sanders going? That's a new one, right? We haven't heard that. Now, I've heard Shedeur might fall, but I don't really expect the Steelers to be players in that market. I don't expect them to draft Jackson Dart in the first round. I think they're interested in Jackson Dart, but like as a third round, not as a first or second rounder. That's really the theme I'm getting from this entire class is the Steelers like some of these guys, right? They like Shedeur Sanders. They like Jackson Dart. They like Jalen Milroe. But all those guys are probably going to go a little too early for them. I don't think they're going to draft one in the first 2 rounds. I think the third round is where we start having discussion. If you get one of those guys to fall down to the third round, you get a Dart falling, maybe Milroe falls. I think you start to see it. But the fourth round, I think, is where we really hit the spot there. Will Howard is, I think, the big name to watch from Ohio State. I think they really like him. I think he hits the sweet spot for their value, too. I know that they like some other guys later in the draft, guys like Max Brosmer and Brady Cook. That could be intriguing for them. They'll draft one, but let's be real here. Don't expect that guy to become the next future of the franchise. Crazier things have happened, but it's not the expectation, obviously. But they'll draft somebody just to have some young upside in that room. But let's talk about kind of where this quarterback situation stands.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I had heard, John, we talked last week about how the Steelers had talked to Russell Wilson's representation and how he didn't talk to Justin Fields' representation at the combine. That remained true, but that has been an open conduit for the Steelers. They have continued to talk to Justin Fields' team. He is the priority. He is the plan A. There is no question about this. The team wants Justin Fields to be their starting quarterback in 2025. Here's the thing. It's a two-way street, and we recognize this. Justin Fields is going to have a really strong market. I know the New York Jets are very interested. I think the Indianapolis Colts are interested. I think the Las Vegas Raiders are interested. So there's at least 3 teams I know of that are interested in Justin Fields and will give him offers. I think the Jets in particular are going to be willing to pay Justin Fields quite a nice amount of money. I also think Justin Fields has some intrigue there. Garrett Wilson, one of his friends from Ohio State, plays with the Jets. I think Tanner Engstrand, the new offensive coordinator from the Lions, I think that is a little bit intriguing. The Lions really rehabilitated Jared Goff really well. Can you kind of get that with Justin Fields? That's the question. But there's intriguing things there, and I think Justin Fields at least wants to see what the market is. The Steelers can lock him up before then. I think, to do that, I think they might have to give him a little sweetener. What that is whether, you pay him a little more, you give him a little more guaranteed money, an extra year on the deal, whatever it might be. But that's what they're going to have to do, and they want to do that. Now, if he wants to test the market, I think you pivot immediately. Your plan B is probably Russell Wilson. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, Russ has teams interested in him too. The Giants and the Raiders and the Titans are all interested in Russell Wilson. So if he hits the open market, he'll have teams bidding for his services as well. But I think the moment the Steelers offer him a deal, Russell Wilson will take it. So the moment the Steelers pivot off Justin Fields, I think Russell Wilson will be coming back if that happens. Now, so we'll see.
Yeah, the key here, though, like you mentioned, is the timing. The Steelers would like to wrap this up before free agency starts. One of these 2 quarterbacks, right? They'd like to have it done by Monday, the 11th. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's what they would like to happen. Yeah, I mean, as you look at it, right, the legal tampering period opens next Monday, I believe, at noon. That means anyone can talk to anybody. So the moment that happens, Russell Wilson and Justin Fields can start talking to other teams. And so once that happens, it becomes the Wild West. The Steelers might have to get into a bidding war for one or both of those players if that happens. That's why they want to get this done, because here's the other thing. We've been talking about wide receiver, right? That's a huge need for this team. The Steelers don't want to add a wide receiver until they know which quarterback they're working with. And so that's going to be extremely important. The other thing with the Russell Wilson stuff is he did ruffle some feathers. Remember when we talked about the Arthur Smith report about taking away the play calling at the line of scrimmage? That did not go over well inside the organization. That's something he's going to have to make amends for. Now, I'll say this. I don't think it's an untenable situation. I think he can certainly do that and make amends, but there's some tension there. He's got some heat in the Steelers organization. So that's going to be something he's going to have to work for over the spring and the summer as the quarterback if he does return. So we'll see. I mean, this is anyone's best guess of what ends up happening. Fields, I think, does have an incentive to test the market, but hey, the Steelers can easily just as incentivize him to not go to the market and give him something that gives him a clear path to the starting role with the Steelers and comes back. So I think that is something to look at. I think he wants stability as well. So while there's an argument for him going to the market, as I mentioned, I also think there's a market that says, hey, you should come back, right? Steelers might get you a little nice money and you get stability. You don't have to learn another offense. You get some stability in your career. This could be a place you can grow. So this quarterback situation is going to be the key thing to watch. I imagine. I don't think we're going to get to. I'll say this. A lot of people have asked me what happens if both of them hit the market. I don't really think we're going to see that. I don't think we're going to see that. If it did happen, I'm not sure. I know they've explored every option. I know they've at least, they've explored Sam Darnold, Daniel Jones, Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins, all these things. They've vetted those options, but it really comes back to one of these guys. It really comes back to Justin Fields or Russell Wilson. Justin Fields is plan A. If he wants to test the market, I think you then pivot to Russell Wilson. And so I think it's going to be one of these two guys by the end of the week. We'll see.
By the end of the week. Wow. And, certainly even though Fields can't talk to other teams, he's hearing the interest in him. And certainly his agent is whispering in his ear about the interest from other teams and maybe even potential dollar figures. So if he's intent on testing the free agency market, it's pretty much ruling him out as a Steeler because they're going to pivot to Russell Wilson to get that deal done before Monday. That's the take.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I think you're going to see one of these two guys under contract. I do think that's ultimately what they're doing. That's where their energy is currently going towards. Now, maybe there's a scenario where they go and look and say, hey, we think we at least have a certain budget we can work with and we're willing to let these guys hit the market, but there's so much that could happen once you hit the market. A team offers somebody some insane money, whatever. You can really risk it by doing that. So if you want one of these guys back, you got to make sure it happens. And so I really think that's what's going to happen. One of these two guys is going to sign. I think if it's Fields, you're probably going to hear about sooner than later. That's my guess. I think a Russell Wilson signing is probably a later in the week thing where it's pretty clear that the Steelers and Justin Fields aren't going to reach one. He wants to go test the market, and the Steelers turn back around and say, okay, we're going to Russell Wilson. So I think that's kind of what the timeline will be. But before that Monday, listen, they could sign one of these two at Monday at 10 o'clock before the legal tampering period opens. That's not out of the question. This could go down to the buzzer. But I think before 12 o'clock next Monday, which is when that legal tampering period opens, one of these two will be under contract.
Well, I believe I saw on social media that Justin Fields' birthday is tomorrow. So wouldn't that be interesting if the news came tomorrow where the Steelers give him that sweet offer and the starting job and prevent him from hitting that open market? That would be interesting. And of course, you have the other side encapsulated by, there was a screed written by Mark Madden, who's sort of like the bombastic radio personality out in Pittsburgh, and basically saying, Fields, don't take the Steelers offer. They're going to try to turn you into a no-risk robot. They're not going to let you utilize all of your talents, and kind of look what they did to you, in the 6 games that you played for them last year. That your upside in Pittsburgh is simply not there. What do you make of that? The evaluation might not just be, okay, he's getting the same playbook, he's getting the starting job, but actually this potential of him to sort of realize that high first round pick that he was, is that potential there in Pittsburgh, or is it better? Is the grass greener in some of these other places where he's likely to get offers in terms of him reaching his full potential of what he thinks he can be in the age of a mobile quarterback, winning Super Bowls?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that that's something to keep an eye on. I do think when we look at the Jets, for example, people think, oh, they're the Jets. Why would you go to the Jets? Well, new regime, right? New regime completely. New general manager, new coach. Aaron Glenn has that juice, man. He's highly thought of in league circles. Most agents and execs that I talk to love him. So he's gonna draw. He's gonna be a draw. I think people are gonna want to play for Aaron Glenn. He's raw, he's unfiltered, he's emotional, but man, he cares about his players. And so that's the type of coach team players love to play for. I also think, as I mentioned, I think their offensive coordinator Tanner Engstrand, who worked under Ben Johnson in Detroit, is an intriguing kind of look at for a guy like Fields, where you look at the offensive nature of the NFL, it's moving more and more towards that type of offense, right? Ben Johnson's kind of this cutting edge guy, and Engstrand works under him. Angstrad's thought of very highly in NFL circles too. So if Justin Fields thinks very highly of him, I think that's going to be something, and that's probably why you want to hit the market, because in the legal tampering period, Justin Fields can talk to Angstrand and kind of get a feel for him, right? Does he like him? Does he not like it? Et cetera, et cetera. And I will also say this: Arthur Smith in the past has proven he's been able to rehabilitate quarterbacks. So it's not like Arthur Smith is a complete nobody in terms of getting better quarterback play, guys. Ryan Tannehill literally got a huge contract with Tennessee because of what Arthur Smith did. And so, that is something to always keep in mind as well. But yeah, I think Justin Fields just wants to vet his options, man. He hasn't hit free agency before. This is his first time hitting the open market. He not only wants the best fit for himself, but I think he also wants to see, can I get a bag while finding that fit? Because he hasn't been paid, right? Russell Wilson has been paid. Russell Wilson's been there. He's made franchise quarterback money. So there is no need for Russell Wilson to do as much vetting as Justin Fields will have to do. And so that is all things that wrap up into this decision. We'll see where it goes.
All right. And I will say this, as soon as we get official word that a quarterback has been inked by your Pittsburgh Steelers, we are going to convene an emergency edition of this podcast to break it all down. So have that on your radar, because we're going to jump on that major development, because that will be the first domino falling into place for 2025. Now, speaking of the other side of free agency, where the Steelers look to pluck talent from other teams being made available, you mentioned two key positions that they love in free agency versus the draft, where lots of talent is also available: cornerback and wide receiver. Why the free agency route at those two positions, and what are the names that the Steelers will be targeting to fill those roles on their roster?
Well, I think it's just a super deep corner group in free agency. Listen, this is a pretty bad free agency class. It's not a great one, but corner is the exception. This is a great corner class in free agency. There's about 10 to 11 guys that are going to be out on the market that are legit players. They're all under the age of 32. I mean, you have guys like Darius Slay that were added, and you'll have the Jair Alexanders that are going to be added to this crop as well. But you look at it just at face value, it's a really strong group. They really want to add someone or two people from this group, and the names are pretty standard. I think you've heard these names before. First of all, they're really interested in Raiders slot cornerback Nate Hobbs. Jared Alexander, the Steelers' new defensive backs coach, who's replacing Grady Brown, was the safeties coach with the Raiders last year, worked directly with Nate Hobbs. And so not a surprise that the Steelers will be interested in him there. They've been looking for a slot corner for a long, long time. And even if they like Beanie Bishop, they want a guy in there. And Nate Hobbs, man, really talented player, and won't break the bank, right? You're not going to have to pay him an absolute boatload of money. You're probably going to have to give him a solid deal, but nothing too crazy. And so you can get him. Outside corner, I think this is maybe where we're going to see them drop a significant amount of money on a player. The three guys that I've really heard about are Carlton Davis, Charvarius Ward, and DJ Reed. Those are all outside guys. Now, listen, that doesn't mean that they can't get into the market for guys like Rasul Douglas, Byron Murphy, Asante Samuel Jr., Paulson Adebo, others that are going to be out there in the market. Same thing with Jair Alexander, et cetera, et cetera. But those are just the three names I've heard a lot. The Steelers are kind of really done with this corner room and what it views as. Listen, Dante Jackson schematically kind of limited them. They felt Beanie Bishop and Cam Sutton schematically limited them. They want to play more man-to-man. They want to play more exotic coverages, and they didn't necessarily feel they were able to do that because they didn't feel like they had the personnel in the corner room to hold up. And, once they started doing that, they started busting coverages. They were beating man-to-man. They kind of were proven right that they didn't have the dogs to run some of the stuff that they wanted to run. And so, when we were talking about some of the predictability, I don't think it excuses it. I think, the schematics and the Steelers' defense were poor last year. But I do think part of that was their lack of confidence in their corners outside of Joey Porter Jr. And they like Corey Trice. They like Beanie Bishop. But one Corey Trice can't stay healthy. He just can't. Beanie Bishop, still a little raw. But they like those two young guys. So they will add two guys, I think, to this. I think that's what they're going to do. So those are the names at corner. Wide receiver is a little different. This wide receiver class, it's deep, But I think every single player I point to has some question. Even a guy like Chris Godwin, who is so good, is coming off that ankle injury. And what are the medicals on that? Devontae Adams, he's 32, but is he going to fall off a cliff sooner rather than later? He hasn't yet, but it's coming at some point. So there are all questions about these guys. But the names I've heard, I'm sure they're going to be in on basically everybody. First of all, they've called about Cooper Kupp. They're obviously going to explore Devontae Adams. They're going to explore some of those. But the three names I heard, first of all, Cortland Sutton. We've heard about Cortland Sutton a lot. He's not formally been made a trade candidate, but you keep hearing murmurs about Cortland Sutton. First of all, he wants a new contract, and him and the Broncos are far apart. I think he wants something like $25 million a year. I think the Broncos don't even want to give him 20. That's significant. So that could be something, and they have to pay their defensive players, guys like Nick Benito. So they need to make a decision there. Probably they can pay both of them, but do they want to pay Cortland Sutton is the question. If the things deteriorate there, I think the Steelers are going to be very involved in Cortland Sutton trade talks. Now, that one is a little bit later in the period. That one is something I think kind of matriculates towards the draft, right? That's something the Steelers don't want to wait for. But they can make that move to strengthen an already kind of adept room. And so the other two that I heard were Darius Slayton and Christian Kirk. Both these two players were two guys they were in on the trade deadline last year. Slayton's going to have a lot of suitors. But the Steelers are going to be in on him. They really like his vertical speed. He could be a nice wide receiver 2-3 type opposite George Pickens, and he can play outside. And then I also think Slayton's not going to break the bank to the point where if you want to trade for a Cortland Sutton or you want to draft a first-round wide receiver, you can do that. The other guy is Christian Kirk. They were going to trade for Christian Kirk last year. The issue is Kirk broke his collarbone the week before the trade deadline. So that nixed the deal. But he would have been a Pittsburgh Steeler. It would not have been Mike Williams. It would have been Christian Kirk had that not happened. And so they're interested in him as well. We'll see what the Jaguars do. They have a new regime. So no bets that they're going to let go of Christian Kirk. But if they do, the Steelers will be interested in him. They'll call pretty much everybody. They'll vet markets here. So those are just three names. But, man, they're going to be all over the board at wide receiver. I have heard that they have different plans for the quarterback they get. So a Russell Wilson plan will look a little different than the Justin Fields plan at that position. But they have names at both spots. So wide receiver is going to be very important for the Steelers. And it doesn't rule out a later trade for a big-time player or a draft pick in the first or second round of the NFL draft.
I kind of like both of those strategies because the difference between free agency and the draft, free agency, you are buying production, especially when you're talking about blue chip free agents of the kind, you were talking about it at the cornerback position. So that's your immediate production, plug and play guys. Whereas the draft, you're always drafting potential, even in the first round. You're drafting upside. You're not drafting necessarily a day one starter. You know what I mean? And when you have a cornerback room that failed miserably and it was a source of limiting your defense, that's got to be corrected. And at wide receiver, we know Omar Khan, the general manager, left the Steelers deprived of talent at that position in 2024. It was a major mistake. He's bound to make up for it. And as you said, he might do double duty at wide receiver, going both the free agency route and maybe even a number one pick at 21 in that draft if the right receiver falls to the Steelers at that position, which would be a big move, or like you said, a big trade with Denver as the potential, but shore up the room early in free agency with those names and get more talent into that room. So both of those strategies sound good to me. With defensive line, we already talked about in previous episodes how the draft is loaded there. Is there any argument going the free agency route at that position, also an area of need because they were gashed in the running game down the stretch? Or is it one of those scenarios where maybe some of the names out there, you wonder how much tread is left on the tire?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I do think the Steelers are going to want to look at defensive line. And are going to want to maybe multi-prong it. I don't think it's always necessarily going to be just a draft pick or just a signing. It might be both, right? Just as like we talked about with wide receiver. They have 4 very specific needs that they want to attack this offseason. And I mean, we've talked about those needs before. We've talked about how those needs are corner, wide receiver, defensive line, and running back. And defensive line, they need 2 or 3 guys there just for depth needs. They really only have Montravius Adams as a depth player. Again, I think this week we could probably expect Larry Ogunjobi to be gone. It could be a cap casualty. But there are players out there that they'll be interested in it. Guys like Tershawn Wharton, guys like Milton Williams, guys like Javon Hargrave, former Steeler nose tackle. I think they'll be interested in some of those guys in free agency. So, you could get a more minor move as well. You could get a guy like Taylor Tart or Puna Ford, someone that's more of a depth piece, a rotational piece. They need those rotational pieces too. They only have one depth defensive lineman. Maybe Isaiah Loudermilk circles back. I think Dane Lowry has a chance to be cut as well. So I do think the Steelers are going to need depth guys there. So I think you're going to at least expect 1, maybe 2 in the free agency period. It might not be a big signing, but you need depth players on the defensive line. If you think you have enough defensive linemen, no, you don't. That is usually kind of the adage. It's what Howie Roseman lives by in the Eagles. If you're trying to mimic them, that's the type of philosophy you're going by. So the Steelers are probably going to look at that, but we already talked about this. This is a deep, stupid deep defensive line draft. And Derek Harmon, Kenneth Grant, and Walter Nolan at 21 all make sense. All 3 of those guys on the defensive line make different types of sense. You can go to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th round. You can get guys there. You can double dip. You can do so many different things on the defensive line this year. So expect that position to be heavily addressed at some point this offseason, potentially in both the free agency and the draft periods.
Yes, you mentioned Howie Roseman. He admitted that he is in Addicts Anonymous because of his unhealthy obsession in drafting linemen on both the offensive and defensive line. It's just one of his things. He can't get enough of those guys. And the Steelers hopefully will follow suit and try to emulate those Super Bowl champions out in Philly. Going back to the combine, and you mentioned the running back position, which we agree the preferred avenue for the Steelers is to part ways with Najee Harris and then go to the draft to get a speed home run outside guy that more fits with Arthur Smith's offense. Where do they think they can draft and receive a running back, and which of those guys are going to be very attractive to the Steelers, and in what rounds? I mean, where are the realistic choices for the Steelers at wide receiver to fit their offense?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Its specific wide receiver could fit in anywhere. First of all, there's different archetypes of receivers all throughout the class. You've got the Igbukas, you've got the Burdens, you've got the Matthew Goldens, you've got that in the first round. All 3 of those guys, they're different players. Even in the second round, you got Jack Best, you got Trey Harris, Savion Williams, Jalen Noel, Alec Ayaminor. I mean, there's so many different types of receivers. So that is something to look at. Will they look at speed? Will they look at slot guys? Will they look at outside guys? I think they're going to look at outside guys that can maybe play outside. They could be slot Z guys, so they can play inside and outside. But I have a hard time thinking of them going to just slot-specific players. So that's something to look at. And then running back, I mean, when you look at running back, right, the speed that they're going to want is going to be key. I think they're going to want that. And so there are a number of running backs in this class that they met with at the combine. They met from everyone from Ashton Jeanty to Caleb Johnson to Amarian Hampton to Quinshawn Judkins to Travian Henderson to Jordan James to Jaden Blue, Bashil Tootin. I mean, all these guys, right? The names I just listed to you are literally going to be a guy that is going to be a locked first-round pick in Ashton Jeanty to a guy that might be a fourth-round pick in Bashil Tootin. And so they are interested in these guys up and down the board. And it's interesting because it's so deep and such a different archetype of guys. But every guy I mentioned, for the most part, I think you can look at a guy like Hampton more as a gap runner. But everyone else I think I mentioned is a zone runner. Steelers want a guy that fits Arthur Smith's scheme more. It really depends, I think, on how the value falls. You know, if Caleb Johnson or Travian Henderson's there at 52, I mean, they're in play. It doesn't matter. They're in play. If you get a Quinshawn Judkins to fall 83, right? There's some things that just happen sometimes that make you change plans on the fly. I remember the Steelers having that happen to them a few times. Juju Smith-Schuster falling to them in the second round of the 2017 draft was a really big one that I remember. More recently, they kind of shifted plans when they held the 33rd pick in the 2023 draft. They were kind of thinking maybe they would trade out of that, and then Joey Porter Jr. fell to them, and so they drafted him. And so things happen. It really, I think this is the big thing about running back is, one, we don't expect Najee Harris to return, right? I think that's the big thing. So if he returns, I still think even if Najee Harris returns, they are going to draft a running back. So no matter what, I think a running back is on the board at some point in this class. But if he's not back, it becomes more urgent, right? It's just going to be Jaylen Warren in that room because I don't think Cordell Patterson's going to be back. So you need someone. And so I think if you can fill in the blanks at defensive line, wide receiver, and corner a little bit, it gives you the flexibility to go up and say, hey, we can take one of those second round backs. Or if you aren't able to fully address those positions and you feel like you have to go defensive line, wide receiver, or some iteration of those positions, you can wait a little bit. I think that's the cool thing about this class is, yes, you can get one of those great talents in the second round. I think there's a big time argument to be made for that because let's be real, the offense just needs talent. But I think you also have guys in the third or fourth round, guys like Jaden Blue, guys like Bashal Tutin, Jarquez Hunter, that Damian Martinez, guys that are good players that can be legitimately good backs for you right out the gate. And so it depends on what the Steelers want. It depends on how they address their free agency needs. But I think running back is the most elastic position for them in this class. They can draft that anywhere on the board.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be interesting to see how the board falls and then where they pluck their running back. Because I do agree with you that I think, at pick 21, it could be wide receiver or D-line. Do we see any other position at pick 21 for them?
I don't think necessarily. I think corner is an outside shot. If they don't completely address corner in free agency, I think there's an outside shot because there's two things that I did hear at the combine. One, I think Will Johnson, the Michigan corner, who was thought of pre-draft, kind of the preseason as a top 5 player. He had a bad injury this year, missed most of the year, didn't have a great year when he played. He might fall a little bit. And if he does, the 21, that's a blue chip talent that maybe you would take. Think about that player. But I also think the other guy, let's say they don't get a slot corner in free agency, they get an outside guy. I think one guy you can pay attention to is Jahdae Barron out of Texas. This guy, they love this guy. They had him in a formal meeting. He blew them away. His intangibles are through the roof. And so if they, again, corner is kind of a weird one, right? Where I don't necessarily expect it to happen, but there's 2 players there that are clearly Steelers guys that they clearly will love. And if the board falls right, if they address the right picks of free agency, if things go well enough there, and they happen to have, let's say they fix defensive line and it leaves a hole at slot corner, I think Barron becomes a much more kind of appealing option at 21. But they love both those guys, Will Johnson and Jahdae Barron. So I guess that would be the position. Listen, we can always talk about crazy, outlandish things. I believe before the combine, Daniel Jeremiah had Ashton Jeanty falling to them at 21. I mean, if that happens, I think you have to call the audible and draft Ashton Jeanty, right? I don't think there's any question about that. But let's be real here. He's not getting anywhere close to you. So don't expect that one to happen. But I do think right now, when we're looking at realistic scenarios, defensive line and wide receiver are the 2 positions. And then there's this little outside chance of cornerback. But as we mentioned, corner seems to be a free agency need. If they get those 2 guys in free agency, you can probably wipe that off.
Yeah, that's why free agency is going to be so interesting because I do think it's going to really sharpen the focus then on what work remains to be done in the draft. And certainly, after the running back impact that we saw in 2024, where key running backs had switched teams and made their mark in several places, this idea of not drafting a running back in the first round is out the window. I mean, that, like you said, Gentry is going to go. Where would you say he's going to go in this draft?
I mean, he'd go as high as 6 to the Raiders. I mean, that makes sense to me. I mean, if when we're talking about the Steelers sitting at 21, I mean, the Broncos pick right before them. The Broncos need a running back. So you feel like they would take him at 20. But I really think, 6 to the Raiders, 12 to the Cowboys. That's a Cowboys pick. If you've ever seen one. I mean, I think this guy's a top 15 pick. So I don't see it happening.
All right. Well, things are again getting closer and closer and more in focus. And it's really going to jump off the hook when the Steelers land their quarterback and then look to the opening of free agency where they can start reaching out and bringing talent in from other teams. That'll be a welcome sight to see as the Steelers seek playmakers in 2025. And we'll be covering it all right here on the podcast. So we're here every Tuesday. And of course, as events warrant with the quarterbacks, we will be back for an emergency edition as needed. Until then, those Steelers, get those playmakers.